She was forced to marry him to save her brother, believing it was just a deal. But she never expected her cold, ruthless husband to become dangerously obsessed, and now escaping him might be impossible. Section 1. The sharp sound of breaking glass shattered the tense silence of the grand dining hall. Isabella flinched as the delicate wine glass slipped from her fingers, crashing onto the marble floor in jagged pieces. Her heart pounded in her chest, drowning out the murmurs and gasps from the guests around her. She hadn't meant to drop it, but how could she not? Sitting across from her, his piercing gray eyes locked onto her like a predator watching its prey, was Dominic Blackwood, the man she was being forced to marry. This wasn't supposed to happen. Just days ago, Isabella Carter had been living an ordinary life, if struggling to keep a roof over her head and food on the table for her younger brother Jeremy could be called ordinary. Their parents had died years ago, leaving them with nothing but a mountain of debts. Isabella had done everything she could to shield Jeremy from the cruel reality of their lives, working long hours, taking odd jobs, and fighting to keep their tiny apartment. But it hadn't been enough. She hadn't known Jeremy was borrowing money, not until last night when he staggered into their apartment, bloody and beaten, whispering a name that sent chills down her spine. Dominic Blackwood, billionaire, chief executive officer of Blackwood Enterprises, ruthless businessman, and, according to whispers in the underground, a man whose debts were never left unpaid. The moment Jeremy choked out the name, Isabella knew they were doomed. She didn't ask how much he owed, because it didn't matter. There was no way they could pay it back. And then Dominic himself had arrived. The memory of that night haunted her. The way he had stepped into their apartment, perfectly composed in his tailored suit, looking entirely out of place in their tiny, run-down living room. How he had gazed down at Jeremy, barely sparing him a glance before turning his attention to her. "You'll never be able to repay me," he had said, his voice smooth, unreadable, "but I'm willing to offer you another way." She hadn't understood at first, and then he had spoken the words that changed everything. "Marry me." She had laughed, a cold, bitter laugh. "That's ridiculous." Dominic had simply smiled, slow and calculating. "You don't have a choice, Isabella. Either you marry me, or your brother suffers the consequences of his actions." Her blood had turned to ice. She had known, in that moment, that he was serious. The way he said it, the way his eyes never wavered, the way he carried himself with the weight of absolute power. Dominic Blackwood was not a man who bluffed. And now, here she was, sitting across from him at their engagement dinner, in a room filled with the city's most powerful elites, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Dominic's expression didn't change as she stared at him, her hands trembling in her lap. He didn't even flinch at the sound of the glass shattering. If anything, the corner of his lips lifted in amusement. "Careful, Isabella," he murmured, his voice a quiet warning. "We wouldn't want anyone to think you're nervous, would we?" She clenched her fists. Nervous, she was terrified, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of knowing that. Swallowing the lump in her throat, she forced herself to meet his gaze. "What do you expect me to do? Smile and pretend I want this?" His smirk deepened, his fingers tapping lazily against the tablecloth. "Yes." She sucked in a sharp breath. Of course he did. Dominic Blackwood was the kind of man who expected the world to bend to his will. A man who was used to control, to power, to getting exactly what he wanted. And right now, what he wanted was her. Her stomach twisted. She still didn't understand why her, why this. There were 100 different ways he could have ruined her brother's life. He could have taken everything from them, thrown them out onto the streets, crushed them without a second thought. But instead, he had chosen this: marriage. A transaction, he had called it, a deal. And yet the way he was looking at her now, with something dark and unreadable in his eyes, sent shivers down her spine. Was that really all this was? The clinking of silverware and hushed whispers filled the dining hall as the waitstaff hurried to clean up the broken glass. Isabella's face burned with embarrassment as she felt the weight of 100 curious gazes on her. She didn't belong here. She had grown up scraping by, surviving paycheck to paycheck. These people, these billionaires, socialites and heirs to vast fortunes, lived in a world she could never understand. And Dominic was at the very top of it, cold, calculating, unreachable. Her soon-to-be husband. The thought sent a fresh wave of panic crashing over her. She had agreed to this to save Jeremy. That was the only reason. And yet, as she sat there watching Dominic watch her, something told her that she had made a deal with the devil himself. His voice cut through the hum of conversation. "Come with me." She hesitated. "What?" Dominic pushed his chair back, rising to his full height. "Come. Now." People were staring, whispers were growing louder. Her pulse raced as she stood on shaky legs, following him out of the dining hall and into a secluded hallway. The second the doors shut behind them, she spun to face him, her hands clenched into fists. "What is this really about, Dominic?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you choose me?" His gaze was unreadable, his expression carefully controlled. And then he took a step closer. Instinctively, she stepped back, her spine pressing against the wall. He didn't touch her, didn't move any further, but his voice dropped, low and lethal. "I don't like repeating myself, Isabella. You are mine now. That is all you need to know." Her breath caught. Mine. There was something terrifying about the way he said it, as if it wasn't just a statement but a vow, a warning. She forced herself to glare at him, to keep her voice steady. "I will never be yours." For a long moment he just watched her, and then he smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent ice down her veins. "We'll see about that." Her stomach twisted, because deep down she knew Dominic Blackwood never lost, and now she was his next conquest. Section 2. The moment Isabella stepped into Dominic's mansion, she felt the walls closing in around her. The towering estate loomed in the darkness, its grand marble pillars and massive iron gates designed to intimidate. It worked. She had spent the car ride here in absolute silence, staring out the window as the city lights blurred past. And now, standing in the middle of his cold, pristine home, she felt like she had walked straight into a trap. A contract, a signature, a deal that had sealed her fate. This was not her home. It never would be. Dominic walked ahead of her, his polished shoes echoing through the empty hallways. The entire house was eerily silent, save for the soft ticking of an expensive grandfather clock in the corner. The air smelled of fresh pine and something deeper, like power, like control, like him. "You'll stay in the guest room for now." His deep voice broke the silence and she stiffened. "My staff will bring your things in the morning. Everything you need will be provided." Her jaw tightened. "You mean everything I need to pretend this is normal?" He stopped in front of a set of double doors and turned to face her. "You agreed to this, Isabella. You knew exactly what you were walking into." Her stomach twisted. Did she? Did she really understand what it meant to belong to a man like him? "You forced me into this," she shot back. "Let's not pretend this was my choice." His eyes darkened, something unreadable flickering in the depths of his gaze. "You signed the contract, didn't you? To protect my brother," she snapped. "That doesn't mean I accept this as my reality." A muscle in his jaw ticked, but he remained composed, his expression unreadable. "Reality is irrelevant. This is happening whether you accept it or not." Isabella's chest rose and fell sharply. She wanted to scream, to fight, to run, but there was nowhere to go. Dominic moved closer, slow and deliberate, until she could feel the heat of his presence. He was so close, she could see the way his lips curled in amusement, the way his fingers flexed at his sides, as if he were holding himself back. "You hate me," he murmured, his voice impossibly soft. She glared at him. "I don't hate you. Hate is too personal. I feel nothing for you." For a brief second, something flickered in his expression, something sharp, almost dangerous. And then he smirked. "Good," he said, stepping back. "Keep it that way." And just like that, he turned on his heel and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the house, leaving her standing there with her heart pounding in her chest. This was her life now. A marriage built on obligation, a future shackled to a man she barely knew. But one thing was certain. She would never let Dominic Blackwood own her heart. The next morning, Isabella woke to the unfamiliar scent of expensive linen. The bed beneath her was softer than anything she had ever slept on, the silk sheets cool against her skin. It took her a moment to remember where she was, and then it hit her. Dominic. The marriage, the contract, the suffocating reality of it all. She sat up abruptly, pushing the covers off her, her pulse racing. She couldn't stay here. She had to find a way out. Slipping out of bed, she padded across the massive guest room, her bare feet sinking into the plush carpet. The room was as lavish as she had expected. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a walk-in closet larger than her entire apartment, an ensuite bathroom that looked like something out of a five-star resort. but it wasn't hers. None of this was hers. A knock on the door startled her. She stiffened. "Come in," she called hesitantly. The door opened and a woman in a crisp black uniform stepped inside, bowing slightly. "Good morning, ma'am. Mr. Blackwood asked me to inform you that breakfast is ready. He's waiting for you in the dining hall." Her stomach churned. The thought of sitting across from him, pretending they were something they weren't, made her sick. "I'm not hungry," she said quickly. The maid hesitated. "Mr. Blackwood was quite insistent that you join him." "Of course he was." With a resigned sigh, she nodded. "Fine, I'll be there in a minute." The woman left and Isabella took a deep breath, steadying herself. She could do this. She could sit through one meal, tolerate his presence, and figure out how to survive this. Squaring her shoulders, she stepped out of the room. The Blackwood estate was even larger than she had realized. The hallways stretched endlessly, adorned with priceless paintings and chandeliers that dripped with crystals. She followed the scent of coffee and warm bread, her footsteps light as she made her way toward the dining hall. And then she saw him. Dominic sat at the head of a long, polished dining table, sipping from a cup of black coffee. He was dressed in another impeccable suit, his hair neatly styled, his expression unreadable as he glanced up at her. "Sit," he said simply. She hesitated for only a second before lowering herself into the chair across from him. The food in front of her looked straight out of a magazine, perfectly arranged platters of fruit, eggs, fresh pastries, and steaming coffee. It was too much, too extravagant, too wrong. Dominic watched her, his fingers tapping lightly against his cup. "Eat." She picked up her fork, forcing herself to take a bite. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. Finally, she set her fork down. "Why are you doing this?" He arched a brow. "Doing what?" "Pretending this is real." He didn't blink. "It is real." She exhaled sharply. "This marriage is a contract, Dominic. A business deal. So why the grand gestures? Why the perfect breakfast, the mansion, the contract states that you are my wife," he interrupted smoothly. "So you will live as my wife." She bristled. "You don't own me." A slow smile curled at his lips. "Don't I?" Her breath caught. It was the way he said it, so calmly, so confidently, as if it were an indisputable fact. And maybe, in his mind, it was. She hated that. "Do you enjoy controlling people?" she asked coldly. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back, his gaze steady on hers. "I enjoy getting what I want." Her stomach twisted. "And what is it that you want?" she whispered. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "You'll find out soon enough." A chill ran down her spine. She had walked straight into his world, thinking she could fight him, thinking she could resist him. But Dominic Blackwood was not a man who played fair, and something told her that this was only the beginning. Section 3. Isabella spent the next few days trapped in a routine that wasn't hers. Every morning she woke up in the lavish guest bedroom that smelled like fresh linen and something unmistakably expensive. Breakfast was always ready, perfectly prepared, with Dominic waiting at the head of the massive dining table like a king surveying his kingdom. And every time she sat across from him, his piercing blue eyes studied her as if he was waiting for something. She refused to give him the satisfaction of asking what. Her days were eerily quiet. The Blackwood mansion was massive, yet it felt empty. Dominic rarely spoke to her outside of mealtimes, instead vanishing into his office or disappearing into the city for meetings. She was left to wander the halls alone, surrounded by luxury she neither wanted nor needed. But the worst part was the way Dominic watched her. Even when he wasn't in the room, she could feel his presence everywhere. The maids, the butlers, the security guards. They were polite, professional, but their eyes followed her as if they were waiting for instructions. She wasn't just a guest in this house, she was a prisoner. She needed a plan, and she needed to escape. The first time she tried to leave, she barely made it past the front gates. It was late in the afternoon, and she had spent the entire morning gathering her courage. She had no phone, no money, but she wasn't going to let that stop her. She would find a way. The moment she stepped outside, she was met with an estate so large it looked more like a small kingdom. The driveway stretched for what felt like miles, lined with towering oak trees and an intricate wrought iron fence that surrounded the entire perimeter. The gates stood tall in the distance, a final barrier between her and freedom. She took a deep breath and started walking. With every step, her heart pounded harder. The sun cast a golden hue across the estate, the cool breeze brushing against her skin. It almost felt normal. Almost. She reached the gates, her fingers curling around the cold iron bars. She took a deep breath and pushed. Nothing. They were locked. A rush of frustration surged through her, her fingers tightening against the metal. She scanned her surroundings, searching for another way out. And that's when she saw him. Dominic. He was standing by the grand fountain near the main house, watching her with unreadable eyes. He was dressed in his usual dark suit, his stance relaxed, his hands tucked into his pockets as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. Her stomach twisted. He had known. He had been watching. Slowly, he started walking toward her, his long strides deliberate, controlled. "You're not leaving," he said calmly, stopping just a few feet away from her. Her jaw clenched. "You can't keep me here forever." His lips twitched, almost as if he found the entire situation amusing. "You agreed to stay, Isabella, and I don't take kindly to broken promises." Her hands balled into fists. "This isn't a promise, it's a prison." Something dark flickered in his expression. "You're free to go whenever you want." She blinked in surprise. Was he serious? "But," he continued smoothly, "if you walk out those gates, you're on your own. No money, no protection, and let's not forget who your brother owes money to." Her breath caught. The loan sharks. She had made this deal to protect Gabriel, to ensure his safety. If she left now, Dominic wouldn't lift a finger to help him. "You wouldn't," she whispered, her voice trembling. His expression remained unreadable. "Try me." She stared at him, her pulse racing. She wanted to call his bluff, to tell him he wouldn't dare, but deep down she knew the truth. Dominic Blackwood never bluffed. She had no choice. Slowly she let go of the gate, her shoulders slumping in defeat. Dominic's gaze softened, just barely. "Good girl." Her head snapped up, fury burning in her eyes. "Don't call me that." A smirk tugged at his lips, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned and started walking back toward the house. "Come inside," he said over his shoulder. "Dinner will be ready soon." She hated him. She hated the way he manipulated her, the way he twisted every situation in his favor. But most of all, she hated the fact that no matter how much she resisted, she was still here. That night, Isabella lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind a chaotic mess of emotions. She needed another plan. She needed leverage, and there was only one way to get it. She had to understand Dominic. He had built an empire from nothing, ruthless, unforgiving, feared by many. But what made him this way? If she could find his weakness, she could use it against him. Determined, she pushed back the covers and slipped out of bed. If she wanted answers, she had to go straight to the source. His office. She moved quietly through the dark hallways, her bare feet barely making a sound against the hardwood floors. The Blackwood mansion was eerily silent at night, the only light coming from the occasional wall sconces. She reached his office door and hesitated. What if he was inside? Her heart pounded. She pressed her ear against the door. Nothing. Carefully, she turned the knob. It opened. The room was massive, lined with towering bookshelves and a sleek black desk that screamed power. Everything was meticulously organized, from the neatly stacked files to the expensive whiskey sitting untouched on the bar cart. She exhaled slowly. This was where he controlled the world, and now she was in it. She moved toward the desk, her fingers trailing over the smooth surface. There had to be something here, something that could help her understand him, help her escape him. Her eyes landed on a small locked drawer. Bingo. She tugged at it, but it wouldn't budge. "Damn it," she muttered under her breath. Looking for something. A chill shot down her spine. She froze. Slowly, she turned around, her breath catching in her throat. Dominic stood in the doorway, arms crossed. His piercing gaze locked onto her like a predator that had just caught its prey. Her heart pounded. He took a step forward. "I have to admit, I was wondering how long it would take you to try this." Her stomach twisted. He knew. He had expected this. A slow, almost amused smile curled at his lips. "You're not as subtle as you think, Isabella." Heat burned through her. "And you're not as untouchable as you think, Dominic." He raised a brow. "Is that so?" She straightened, meeting his gaze head on. "One day I will walk out of here, and when I do, you'll regret ever trying to keep me." His expression darkened, but instead of anger, something else flickered in his eyes. Something dangerous, something possessive. His voice was low, controlled. "You keep saying that, Isabella, but I don't think you realize." He took another step closer until there was barely any space between them. "You don't need to escape," he murmured. Because deep down, you already belong to me. Her breath caught. This man was impossible. But one thing was certain, this game between them had only just begun. Isabella refused to let Dominic's words get under her skin. She didn't belong to anyone, least of all him. Yet as she stood in his office, trapped between him and the massive oak desk, she felt the weight of his presence pressing down on her. Dominic Blackwood was not a man easily ignored. His very existence demanded attention, his confidence bordering on arrogance, his gaze filled with something she didn't want to name. Possession. She clenched her jaw, willing herself to remain calm. If you think you can keep me here forever, you're mistaken. Dominic smirked, tilting his head slightly. Am I? She stiffened. I don't care how powerful you think you are. I will find a way to leave. His smirk didn't falter. Instead, he reached out and trailed his fingers along the edge of the desk, his gaze never leaving hers. And yet, here you are in my office, trying to dig up dirt on me. If you truly intended to leave, why are you so interested in what I keep hidden? Isabella's stomach twisted. He had a point. She had told herself this was about finding a weakness, a way to escape. But deep down, she knew the truth. She wanted to understand him. Why was he like this? Why did he go to such lengths to control everything, including her? Dominic watched her carefully, as if waiting for her to figure it out herself. You don't know anything about me, she finally said, her voice softer this time. He leaned in slightly, his scent, a mixture of expensive cologne and something inherently masculine, invading her senses. No, Isabella, you don't know anything about me. A shiver ran down her spine, but she held her ground. This was a game, and she refused to lose. Move, she said, her tone sharper now. He didn't. Instead, he placed both hands on either side of the desk, effectively caging her in. I told you before, he murmured, his voice dark, smooth like silk laced with danger. You don't need to escape. Everything you want is right here. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to ignore the way her pulse quickened. Everything I want? She scoffed. You think I want this? His lips curled at the challenge in her tone. I think you want to know the truth. She hated that he was right. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to look him in the eye. Then tell me. Dominic studied her for a long moment, as if debating whether she was ready. Then, with a heavy sigh, he stepped back. Fine, he said, moving toward the bar cart in the corner of the room. You want the truth? Then sit down. Isabella hesitated. A part of her wanted to walk away, to prove she didn't care. But another part, the part that had spent sleepless nights wondering why he was the way he was, wanted to stay. Against her better judgment, she sat down. Dominic poured himself a glass of whiskey, then turned to face her. My father was a bastard, he said, taking a sip. Not just in the figurative sense. He was a real son of a bitch. Isabella blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness of his words. He built the Blackwood empire with ruthless efficiency, crushing anyone who stood in his way. He expected the same from me. Love, family, those were weaknesses. Emotions were a liability. He scoffed, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. I learned at a young age that trust was a fool's game. Isabella frowned. That's why you think you can control everything. Because of him? Dominic let out a low chuckle, but there was no humor in it. Control is the only way to survive, Isabella. His gaze darkened as he looked at her. And I don't take risks when it comes to the things I care about. Her breath caught. Did that mean? Number. She pushed the thought away. You're wrong, she said, her voice firm. Love isn't a weakness. Trust isn't a liability. You only think that because you've never actually let anyone in. Dominic's jaw tightened. And what do you know about trust, Isabella? She hesitated. Then she made a choice. You're not the only one who grew up learning that the world isn't kind, she admitted quietly. I was raised by a single mother. She worked 3 jobs just to keep a roof over our heads. I had to be strong for her. I learned early on that life doesn't give handouts. Dominic watched her closely, his expression unreadable. And then Gabriel got into trouble, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I tried to protect him. I did everything I could. But in the end, I still had to come to you. The room fell into a heavy silence. Dominic set his glass down. You're stronger than I thought, he said, almost approvingly. She narrowed her eyes. I don't need your approval. His lips twitched. No, I suppose you don't. For the first time since they had met, the tension between them wasn't just about power or control. It was something else entirely, understanding. But Isabella wasn't ready to accept that yet. Standing up, she turned to leave. "You're still a bastard," she muttered. Dominic chuckled. "And you're still pretending you don't care." She glared at him over her shoulder. "Good night, Dominic." His smirk faded slightly, his gaze softer now. "Good night, Isabella." She left his office without another word, but as she walked back to her room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something between them had shifted. For better or worse, she wasn't sure. But one thing was certain. Dominic Blackwood wasn't just a man who controlled everything around him. He was a man who had never truly learned what it meant to be loved. And that, more than anything, was dangerous. Section 5. Isabella had always been good at controlling her emotions. She had learned early in life that showing weakness only invited pain, that if you let someone see how much they could hurt you, they would use it against you. But Dominic Blackwood, he was making it impossible to keep her walls up. Ever since their midnight walk, she had been on edge. He hadn't touched her. He hadn't kissed her. He hadn't even said anything inappropriate. And somehow that was worse. He was watching her, not in the way that men usually did, not with lust or amusement. No, Dominic watched her like he was trying to figure her out, like she was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. It made her skin crawl, because she knew that once he figured her out, he would own her completely. She couldn't let that happen. So she did what she always did when things felt out of control. She fought back. That morning, she walked into the dining room with her chin held high, fully prepared to challenge him. Dominic was already there, sipping his coffee like he didn't have a care in the world. The bastard looked good. Too good. Dressed in another one of his impeccable suits, his dark hair slightly tousled. He looked like he had just stepped out of a magazine cover. It irritated her. "Good morning, wife," he said smoothly, setting his cup down. She clenched her jaw. "Don't call me that." He smirked. "But that's what you are, isn't it?" She ignored the way her pulse quickened and took a seat across from him. The butler immediately placed a plate of food in front of her. Eggs, toast, and fresh fruit. She didn't touch it. Dominic arched a brow. "Not hungry?" She met his gaze. "Not in the mood to pretend this is normal." A slow, amused smile spread across his lips. "You think I expect you to pretend?" She folded her arms. "Isn't that what you want? A dutiful little wife who obeys without question?" Dominic leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You misunderstand me, Isabella," he said, voice calm. "I don't want a wife who obeys. I want a wife who understands her place." Her fingers curled into fists. "And what place is that exactly?" He tilted his head slightly. "By my side." She let out a cold laugh. "You think because you forced me into this marriage, I'm just going to fall in line?" Dominic shrugged. "You'll come around." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "You don't know me, Dominic. You don't know what I'm capable of." His eyes darkened slightly. "And you don't know me," he murmured. The tension between them was thick enough to cut. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, as if deciding the conversation was over, Dominic picked up his coffee again. "Eat, Isabella." She narrowed her eyes. "I'm not your pet." His lips twitched. "You say that, but you're already playing into my hands." She stiffened. "Excuse me." He gestured toward her plate. "You're arguing with me, pushing back at everything I say. But in doing so, you're giving me exactly what I want." She swallowed hard. "You're paying attention to me," he continued, voice smooth. "You're thinking about me. You're reacting to me." Her pulse raced. She hated that he was right. She hated that, despite everything, he was already inside her head. She pushed her plate away and stood abruptly. "I'm going out." Dominic arched a brow. "Where?" "Somewhere you're not," she snapped. His smirk widened, but he didn't stop her as she stormed out. She needed air, she needed space, but most of all, she needed to get Dominic Blackwood out of her damn mind. An hour later, Isabella found herself in the estate's massive garden, walking along the stone path lined with roses and perfectly trimmed hedges. It was beautiful. A place meant for fairy tales. Too bad she was living a nightmare. She had to get out of here. She had spent weeks trying to come up with a plan, but no matter how she looked at it, there was no easy escape. Dominic had guards stationed at every entrance. Her phone was monitored, and the few times she had even hinted at leaving, he had made it painfully clear that he wouldn't let her go. She had never felt so trapped in her life. She sat down on a stone bench, exhaling sharply. Enjoying the view? Her entire body went rigid. She turned to find Dominic standing a few feet away, hands in his pockets, watching her. Of course he would show up just when she thought she had a moment to herself. She crossed her arms. Are you stalking me now? He smirked. It's my house, I go where I please. She rolled her eyes. How convenient. Dominic walked closer, stopping in front of her. You're restless, he observed. She didn't respond. You're thinking of running again. Her stomach tightened. Dominic crouched down in front of her, resting his elbows on his knees. You really think I'd let you go? She glared at him. You can't keep me here forever, Dominic. He smiled. A slow, dark smile that sent a shiver down her spine. Can't I? Her breath caught. The way he said it, so casual, so certain, made her blood run cold. She had underestimated him. He wasn't just obsessed with keeping her here, he was obsessed with keeping her, period. And that terrified her. She stood up abruptly, putting distance between them. This marriage is a joke, she said, voice shaking. You don't own me, Dominic. He rose to his feet slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. Don't I? Something about the way he said it made her chest tighten. He wasn't talking about the contract. He wasn't talking about the deal. He was talking about her body, her mind, her heart. She swallowed hard. I'll never love you, she said, forcing the words out. Dominic's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, something dark and something dangerous. Love? He murmured. She took a step back. Yes, love. His lips curled into something almost cruel. You think I need your love? Her heart pounded. He took a step closer. You think I'm doing this because I want some fairy tale romance? Another step. You think I need to hear you say those 3 little words to be satisfied? Her back hit the garden wall. She sucked in a breath, trapped between cold stone and the man who refused to let her go. I don't need your love, Isabella. His voice was low, lethal. I just need you. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't about love. This wasn't about control. This was about possession. Dominic Blackwood didn't just want to keep her. He wanted to own her. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Isabella realized something terrifying. This wasn't just about paying off her brother's debt. This was about survival. Because if she wasn't careful, she wouldn't just lose her freedom. She would lose herself. Section 6. Isabella had spent most of her life learning how to survive. She had grown up in a world where being weak meant being used, where trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. But standing here now, trapped in a marriage with Dominic Blackwood, she realized she had never faced a predator like him before. Dominic was relentless. Not just in his control, not just in his obsession, but in his patience. He was waiting for her to break, and that scared her more than anything. She had spent the last few weeks resisting, pushing back, refusing to let him get under her skin, but he was always there, watching her, making sure she had no way out. Every time she tried to distance herself, he pulled her right back in, and worst of all, she could feel it. Something inside her shifting, something she didn't want to name, because no matter how much she hated him, no matter how much she resented this twisted arrangement, there was a part of her that responded to him, to his touch, to his voice, to the way he looked at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. She hated him, but she hated herself even more for the way her body betrayed her. The morning started like any other. The sun had barely risen when Isabella woke up to the sound of movement in the room. She tensed immediately. Dominic, she didn't have to turn around to know he was there. Ever since the night he had cornered her in the garden, something had changed between them. He had stopped pushing, stopped demanding, but his presence had become heavier, more suffocating, like he was waiting for her to make the next move. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, her back still facing him. You're awake, Dominic said, his voice deep, lazy. She closed her eyes. Unfortunately, she heard the sound of his low chuckle, and it made something inside her snap. She pushed herself up, turning to glare at him. What exactly do you want from me? She demanded. Dominic tilted his head slightly, as if amused by the question. You already know the answer to that. Her jaw clenched. You got what you wanted, Dominic. I married you. I stayed. What more do you want? His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Something unreadable. Everything, he said simply. She sucked in a sharp breath. He was impossible. infuriating. And the worst part was that she believed him. Dominic Blackwood wasn't the kind of man who settled. If he wanted something, he took it. And for some insane reason, he had decided that she belonged to him. "That's not going to happen," she said firmly, gripping the sheets. Dominic didn't argue. He didn't try to convince her. He simply watched her for a moment longer, then turned toward the door. "Get dressed," he said casually. "We're going out." She frowned. "What?" He glanced over his shoulder. "You heard me." Her stomach twisted. "Where?" His lips curled. "You'll see." And with that, he was gone. An hour later, Isabella found herself sitting in the back seat of Dominic's sleek black car, staring out the window as the city blurred past them. She didn't know where they were going, and he hadn't offered an explanation, but she knew better than to trust him. Dominic wasn't the type to do anything without a reason. And whatever this was, it wasn't just some casual outing. She folded her arms, refusing to look at him. "If this is your idea of a date, you should know that kidnapping isn't very romantic." Dominic smirked. "Kidnapping implies you don't belong to me." She shot him a glare. "I don't." He didn't argue, but he didn't agree either. The silence stretched between them until the car finally slowed to a stop. When she looked out the window, her breath caught. They were outside an orphanage. Her heart pounded as she turned to Dominic. "What is this?" He studied her carefully, then spoke. "This is where I grew up." She blinked. Of all the things she had expected, that wasn't one of them. She had assumed he had come from money, that he had been raised in wealth and privilege, but the way he was looking at the old brick building told her otherwise. She swallowed. "Why are we here?" His gaze didn't waver. "Because you think you know me." A lump formed in her throat. She didn't know what to say. Dominic opened the door and stepped out, then turned to her expectantly. "Come," he said. Isabella hesitated, but curiosity won out. She followed him inside. The air inside the orphanage was thick with nostalgia. The walls were lined with old photographs. The floors were worn from years of tiny feet running across them. The scent of freshly baked bread filled the hallways. It didn't feel like the kind of place that could create a monster like Dominic Blackwood. And yet, as they walked through the halls, she noticed the way his body tensed, the way his hand curled into a fist at his side. This place held memories. Not all of them good. They stopped in front of a small office, and an elderly woman sitting at a desk looked up. Her face lit up with a smile. "Dominic." Isabella's eyes widened slightly. She had never heard his name spoken with so much warmth before. The woman stood and walked around the desk, pulling Dominic into a tight hug. "I heard you were back in town," she said, patting his cheek. "Still causing trouble?" Dominic chuckled, but there was something softer in his expression. "Always." The woman's gaze shifted to Isabella, and her smile grew curious. "And who is this?" Dominic turned to her, his eyes dark with something she couldn't quite place. "This is Isabella," he said simply. The woman studied her for a long moment, then nodded approvingly. "You're the first person he's ever brought here," she said. Isabella's breath caught. She looked at Dominic, but he wasn't watching her. His gaze was on the floor, his jaw tight. A strange feeling settled in her chest. This was important to him, this place, these people. For the first time since she had met him, she saw something vulnerable in his eyes, and it made her hate him a little less. She turned back to the woman and forced a smile. "It's nice to meet you." The woman smiled back, but there was a knowing look in her eyes. "Take care of him," she said quietly. Isabella's stomach twisted. She didn't know why, but those words felt heavier than they should have. She glanced at Dominic again, but he still wasn't looking at her. And for the first time since this nightmare started, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was more to him than she had thought. Maybe he wasn't just a monster. Maybe he was something worse. A man who had been broken once, and who had learned how to break others in return. Section 7. Isabella sat in silence for most of the car ride back. The visit to the orphanage had left her unsettled in a way she couldn't quite explain. She had expected Dominic to be ruthless, cold, a man who only cared about power and control. But now, cracks had formed in the image she had built of him in her mind. She had seen the way the older woman at the orphanage had looked at him, the way Dominic had softened, even if just slightly, in her presence. There was history there, and history meant emotions. It meant that Dominic Blackwood wasn't just a heartless monster. He had once been something else, someone else, and that realization unsettled her more than anything. She didn't want to feel sympathy for him. didn't want to acknowledge the possibility that underneath the cruelty, the obsession, the unyielding control, he was human. Because if she admitted that, it would be harder to hate him. And hate was the only thing keeping her sane. She folded her arms and turned to look at him. "Why did you take me there?" Dominic didn't glance away from the road. "Because you think you have me figured out." Her fingers tightened against her arms. "And what? That was supposed to change my mind about you." His grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly, but his voice remained calm. "It was supposed to show you that things aren't always as simple as you think." She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "It doesn't change anything, Dominic." His lips curled slightly. "Maybe not today." Her jaw clenched. The worst part, he was right, because now, no matter how much she wanted to, she couldn't stop thinking about him. About the past he never talked about. About the man he might have been before the world hardened him into something unrecognizable. She hated that she wanted to know more. Hated that a small part of her wondered what would have happened if they had met under different circumstances. Would he have still been this possessive, this controlling, or would he have been someone else entirely? Someone she could have loved. She cut the thought off before it could take root. It didn't matter, because this was the Dominic Blackwood she knew, and no amount of nostalgia or broken past could change that. That night, Isabella couldn't sleep. She lay in the massive bed she had been forced to share with Dominic since their marriage, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Dominic was sleeping beside her, his breathing steady, his body completely still. She hated how comfortable he looked. Hated that this arrangement didn't seem to bother him at all. She turned onto her side, watching him through the dim light filtering through the curtains. Even in sleep he looked powerful. His sharp jawline, the slight furrow in his brow, the way his chest rose and fell in steady breaths, it was infuriating. And yet, she couldn't look away. She hated him. So why did she feel drawn to him? She clenched her fists, forcing herself to turn back onto her back. This was just exhaustion. She was just confused, and that was all. She shut her eyes, willing herself to sleep. The next morning, Isabella woke up to an empty bed. It took her a moment to realize Dominic was already gone. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, her body stiff from the restless night. She had barely slept, and now she had to spend another day pretending like everything was fine. She got out of bed and made her way downstairs, expecting the usual silence that filled the mansion. But the moment she stepped into the dining room, she froze. Dominic was there, and he wasn't alone. Seated across from him was a woman, tall, elegant, stunning. She had dark, wavy hair that cascaded down her back, sharp green eyes, and a confidence that practically oozed from her posture. And the way she was looking at Dominic, like she owned him. Isabella's stomach twisted. She had no right to feel jealous, no reason to feel territorial, and yet she did. She hated herself for it. "Good morning, Isabella," Dominic said, his voice smooth, unreadable. The woman turned to look at her, an amused smirk playing on her lips. "So you're the wife." The way she said it made Isabella's skin crawl, like she was something laughable. Isabella lifted her chin. "And you are?" The woman's smirk widened. "Victoria." Dominic didn't offer any explanation, and that pissed Isabella off even more. She walked forward, taking a seat beside Dominic, her gaze locked on his. "What is she doing here?" Dominic leaned back in his chair, completely unfazed. "We were just discussing business." Isabella's stomach tightened. Business, right, because women who talked business with Dominic Blackwood usually looked at him like that. She clenched her jaw. She had no claim over him. She didn't care who he spent his time with, and yet the thought of him being with this woman made her blood boil. "Well, don't let me interrupt," she said smoothly, crossing her legs. "I'd love to hear what's so important." Victoria chuckled. "Oh, don't worry, sweetheart. I'm sure you'd find it terribly boring." Isabella smiled tightly. "Try me." Dominic's lips twitched as if he was amused by her sudden attitude. But he didn't stop her, and that meant one thing. This was a test, another twisted game of control, and she refused to lose. Victoria studied her for a moment, then let out a low hum. "Interesting." Isabella didn't blink. "What is?" Victoria's smirk returned. "I can see why he chose you." Isabella's fingers tightened against the armrest of her chair. She wanted to tell Victoria she didn't have a choice, that she wasn't some prize Dominic had won, but saying that would only make her seem weak, and she refused to give this woman the satisfaction. So instead she tilted her head slightly, her expression cool. "And I can see why he didn't choose you." Victoria's smirk faltered, and Isabella knew she had won. Dominic chuckled under his breath, but when Isabella turned to look at him, his expression was unreadable. "That's enough," he said smoothly, rising to his feet. Victoria followed suit, but not before giving Isabella one last lingering glance. "This was fun," she said. "We should do it again sometime." Isabella didn't respond. She just watched as Victoria walked away, her heart still hammering in her chest. And then, when it was just the two of them, she turned to Dominic. "You enjoy this, don't you?" she said quietly. Dominic's gaze flickered. "Enjoy what?" She clenched her jaw. "Watching me fight for a place in your life." His lips curled slightly. "I don't need to watch." Her breath hitched, because she knew exactly what he was implying. She was already his. Even if she didn't want to be, even if she fought against it with everything she had, she belonged to him, and there was nothing she could do to change that. Section 8. Isabella stormed out of the dining room, her blood still boiling. Victoria's smug face was burned into her mind, and Dominic's quiet amusement had only made it worse. He hadn't even defended her, hadn't stopped the woman from taunting her, and that infuriated her more than anything. She was his wife, whether she liked it or not. And yet he had sat there, letting Victoria speak to her like she was nothing. She didn't care what their marriage was built on. She refused to be treated like she was disposable. She marched up to their bedroom, slamming the door shut behind her, her hands shaking with frustration. Why did she let him get under her skin like this? Why did she let him make her feel so small? She hated this, hated him, hated the way he made her feel. She needed to get out of here, needed to breathe. Without thinking, she grabbed a coat and slipped out of the mansion. The guards outside hesitated when they saw her, but she shot them a sharp glare. "I'm going for a walk. Don't follow me." They exchanged glances but said nothing. She walked down the long pathway that led to the estate's private garden, the cold wind biting at her skin. She needed space and needed time to think, because if she stayed in that house a second longer, she was going to lose her mind. Dominic found her an hour later. She was sitting on a stone bench near the rose garden, her arms wrapped around herself, her expression distant. For a moment, he simply stood there watching her. She hadn't run, not yet, but he could see the cracks forming. She was getting closer and closer to breaking, and that terrified him more than he wanted to admit. Without a word, he walked over and sat beside her. She didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge his presence. He exhaled slowly. "Are you done being angry?" She scoffed. "No." A ghost of a smirk tugged at his lips. "I figured." She turned to face him, her eyes burning with frustration. "Why did you let her talk to me like that?" He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Because I wanted to see what you would do." Her breath hitched. Of course, another test, another game. She clenched her jaw. "And did I pass?" He studied her for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "With flying colors." She let out a bitter laugh. "I should have known. Everything with you is a game." His smirk faded. "Not everything." She frowned, but before she could respond, he reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was gentle. Too gentle. It threw her off balance. "You're angry because you think I didn't defend you," he murmured. She swallowed hard. "Because you didn't." His fingers lingered near her jaw for a moment before he pulled away. "I didn't need to," he said simply. "You did that yourself." Her heart pounded. She hated how easily he could twist things, how effortlessly he could make her doubt herself. She shook her head. "I don't understand you, Dominic." His gaze darkened. "You don't need to." She stared at him, searching his face for something, anything, that would give her an answer. But as always, he remained a mystery, a puzzle she could never quite solve. And that scared her more than she wanted to admit, because deep down, she wasn't sure she wanted to solve him. Because if she did, she might start to understand him, and that was dangerous, very, very dangerous. Later that night, Isabella lay in bed staring at the ceiling. She was exhausted, drained, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, her thoughts tangled in knots she couldn't unravel. She turned onto her side, watching as Dominic sat at his desk, flipping through some files. He looked completely unbothered, as if the events of the day hadn't affected him at all. And that only made her more frustrated. "Why do you keep testing me?" she asked suddenly. He didn't look up. "Because I need to know what kind of woman you are." Her fingers curled into the sheets. And now he did look at her, His piercing eyes locked onto hers, a strange intensity in them. "You surprise me," he admitted. She wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she said nothing, and for a while they simply stared at each other, until finally Dominic stood up, walked over to the bed and sat down beside her. "I know you think you hate me," he murmured. She stiffened. "I don't think I know." A slow, knowing smirk spread across his lips. "Then why do you let me touch you?" Her breath caught, her face heated. She hated him, but her body didn't, and he knew it, and he always knew it. She glared at him. "You're delusional." His smirk widened. "Maybe." Before she could respond, he leaned in, so close their noses nearly brushed. "Say the word," he murmured, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "And I'll stop." She hated how her pulse quickened, how her breath hitched, how for just a second she forgot why she despised him. But then reality crashed back into her like a tidal wave. She shoved him away, her voice sharp. "Get out." His smirk didn't fade. If anything, it grew. "Good night, Isabella," he said, standing up. And then, without another word, he walked out of the room, leaving her alone, frustrated and more confused than ever. The next day, Isabella avoided Dominic as much as possible. She needed space, needed to clear her head. But fate had other plans, because just when she thought she could breathe, she received a phone call. A call that changed everything. She answered hesitantly. "Hello?" A cold voice came through the line. "Isabella Carter?" She frowned. "Yes." There was a pause. Then the voice said, "You should keep a closer eye on your husband." Her blood ran cold. "What?" A chuckle, dark, ominous. Then the line went dead. Isabella slowly lowered the phone, her hands shaking. Something was wrong, very, very wrong, and she had a terrible feeling that she was about to find out just how deep Dominic Blackwood's secrets truly ran. Section 9. Isabella's grip on the phone tightened as she stared at the screen, her heart pounding. The call had been brief, too brief to give her any real answers, but the words still echoed in her mind. "You should keep a closer eye on your husband." What did that mean? Was this some kind of sick joke, or was there something deeper, something she wasn't seeing? She swallowed hard, forcing herself to take slow, deep breaths. Panicking wouldn't help. She needed to think. Dominic was powerful, ruthless even. He had enemies, of course he did, but who would go out of their way to warn her about him? And more importantly, why? Her fingers trembled as she scrolled through her contacts, hovering over Dominic's number. Should she call him? If something was really going on, she needed to figure it out herself. If there was one thing she knew about Dominic Blackwood, it was that he was a master of deception. He would never tell her the full truth unless he had no other choice, and she wasn't about to sit back and wait for that moment to come. Isabella quickly grabbed her coat and slipped out of the bedroom, her mind racing with possibilities. The mansion was quiet, too quiet. Usually there were staff moving around, guards stationed in every corner. But tonight, the halls were empty. It felt wrong. Isabella made her way downstairs, glancing over her shoulder every few steps. The silence wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. As she reached the grand foyer, she noticed something strange. The door to Dominic's private study was slightly ajar. Her stomach twisted. Dominic never left his study open. Ever. Something wasn't right. Slowly, cautiously, she approached the door, pushing it open just enough to peek inside. Her breath caught. The massive oak desk was covered in files, papers scattered everywhere, and at the center of it all, a sleek black laptop sat open, the screen casting a faint glow in the dim room. She hesitated. If she stepped inside, there was no turning back, but she had to know. Taking a deep breath, Isabella stepped into the study, closing the door behind her as quietly as possible. Her eyes scanned the papers first. Most of them looked like business reports, financial statements, contracts, nothing too suspicious. But then she spotted something that made her stomach drop. A list of names, dozens of them, and next to each name, a red stamp. Some read APROVED, others, eliminated. Her hands went cold. Eliminated? What the hell did that mean? Her pulse quickened as she flipped through the papers, dread pooling in her gut. Some of the names she recognized, rival businessmen, competitors of Dominic's. Others were unfamiliar. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just business, and this was something else, something much darker. She turned to the laptop, her fingers shaking as she reached for the trackpad. The screen lit up instantly. revealing an open email draft. Her breath caught as she read the subject line, "Target acquired." She clicked on the email, scanning the contents quickly. It was a message to someone named RC, detailing a recent operation and requesting confirmation for the next steps. Her heart pounded. Operation? Target? What was Dominic involved in? She barely had time to process what she was seeing before she heard footsteps approaching. Her stomach twisted. Someone was coming. Quickly, she shut the laptop, placing everything back as neatly as she could. She turned toward the door just as it swung open. And there he was, Dominic. His expression was unreadable, but his sharp eyes took in the room in an instant. His gaze landed on her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice so calm it sent chills down her spine, he said, "What are you doing in here, Isabella?" She swallowed hard, her throat dry. I was looking for you," she lied, forcing her expression to remain neutral. His gaze darkened. "Is that so?" She nodded, her palms clammy. He took a slow step toward her, closing the distance between them. "You should know better than to go through my things," he murmured. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "I wasn't." He cut her off with a single look. She had never been scared of him before, not really, but right now she wasn't sure if the man standing in front of her was her husband, or a stranger, a very dangerous stranger. Dominic didn't say anything else. He simply studied her, his gaze piercing, calculating. Then, without another word, he reached past her and shut the laptop. The air between them was heavy with unspoken tension. Isabella knew she had two options. She could confront him, demand answers, or she could pretend she hadn't seen anything. For now, she chose the latter. She forced a breathless laugh, stepping back. "I didn't mean to snoop," she said, her voice softer than usual. "I was just curious." He arched an eyebrow as if considering whether to believe her. Then, to her surprise, he smirked. "Curiosity can be dangerous," he murmured. She forced herself to smile. "So can secrets." For a split second, something flickered in his eyes, something unreadable. But before she could decipher it, he reached out, brushing a knuckle against her cheek. "You're playing with fire, sweetheart." She forced herself to hold his gaze. "So are you." His smirk widened, but there was something almost admiring in his eyes. "Go to bed, Isabella." She hesitated, then slowly she nodded. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the study. But as she made her way back to their bedroom, her mind raced. She couldn't ignore what she had seen. She couldn't pretend everything was normal. Dominic Blackwood was hiding something, and whatever it was big. She needed to find out the truth, but the real question was, would she survive knowing it? Section 10. Isabella barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the cold, calculating look in Dominic's eyes when he caught her in his study. She saw the names on the papers, the red stamps marking some as eliminated, the mysterious email with the subject line, "Target acquired." What did it all mean? What exactly was Dominic involved in? She tossed and turned, gripping the sheets, her mind a tangled mess of fear and confusion. She had married a man she thought she hated, a man she believed was ruthless but ultimately predictable. Now she wasn't so sure. Was he dangerous? Was he capable of worse? She didn't know, and that terrified her more than anything else. She needed to be smart. If Dominic was hiding something sinister, she had to find out, but she had to do it carefully. One wrong move, and she might not get another chance. The next morning, she woke up to the scent of freshly brewed coffee. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. Dominic was sitting in the chair by the window, reading the morning paper as if nothing had happened the night before, as if he hadn't caught her snooping, as if he hadn't looked at her like a predator assessing its prey. She swallowed hard, forcing her voice to stay calm. "You're up early." He folded the paper neatly and set it aside, his gaze flicking to her. "So are you." She forced a small smile. "Couldn't sleep." Dominic studied her for a long moment. Then he stood and walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. "Are you troubled by something, Isabella?" The way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. Was he testing her? Did he know she had seen more than she was supposed to? She forced herself to shake her head, offering a casual shrug. "Just adjusting, I guess. It's not every day someone gets married like this." His lips curved into a faint smirk. "No, I suppose not." He sat on the edge of the bed, his fingers brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "You'll get used to it." Her pulse pounded. She needed to steer the conversation away from herself. "Are you going to work today?" she asked, her voice light. He nodded. "I have a few meetings." That meant she had a window, a short one, but enough. "Would you like me to come with you?" she offered. "I know I don't know much about your business, but I could learn." Dominic chuckled, shaking his head. "Your job is to enjoy this life, Isabella, not to concern yourself with business." Her stomach twisted. This life, it sounded more like a prison than a privilege. "I'd still like to understand more," she pressed, watching him carefully. Dominic tilted his head slightly as if considering her request. Then he smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "There's plenty of time for that," he said smoothly. "For now, just focus on adjusting." She forced a nod. Of course, but inside she was screaming. She had to be careful. Dominic was already suspicious. As soon as he left the house, Isabella wasted no time. She had to dig deeper, find out what was really going on, and most importantly, figure out if she was in danger. She hurried to his study, pushing open the heavy oak doors. The desk was clean, the laptop was gone, but there had to be something. She scanned the bookshelves, the drawers, the locked cabinets. Nothing. Her frustration grew. There had to be something Dominic had overlooked. Then she noticed it. A small, nearly invisible panel along the bookshelf. Her heart pounded as she pressed against it. Click. The shelf shifted slightly, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a single file. She pulled it out, hands shaking, and flipped it open. Her breath caught. It wasn't just a list of names this time, and it was her name, and Isabella Carter, and next to it, a date. The exact day Dominic had proposed their marriage deal. She flipped through the pages, her stomach twisting as she read. Dominic had planned everything, their marriage, the debt setup, the illusion of a deal. This wasn't just about her brother's debt. This had never been about her brother's debt. It had been about her, from the very beginning. She felt the floor tilt beneath her. Why? Why had Dominic gone to such lengths to trap her? She wanted to believe it was about control, about power, but a deeper, darker fear took root in her chest. What if it was something else? Something even more dangerous? Her hands trembled as she shoved the file back into place, shutting the panel. She couldn't stay here, not anymore. Not when she didn't even know if Dominic was her captor or her stalker. That night, Isabella barely spoke during dinner. Dominic noticed. "You're quiet," he murmured, sipping his wine. She forced a small smile. "Just tired." "Lying doesn't suit you, Isabella." Her grip on the fork tightened. She was running out of time. She needed a plan, but before she could figure out her next move, Dominic's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his expression darkening. Then, without a word, he stood. "I need to take this." He walked toward his office, his posture tense. Isabella's heart pounded. This was her chance, and as soon as he was out of sight, she slipped away. She moved quickly, grabbing a small bag she had packed earlier. She didn't have much, just enough to get away. She just needed to make it to the front door, one step at a time. She reached for the handle, but before she could open it, a deep voice spoke from behind her. "Going somewhere?" Her blood turned to ice. Slowly, she turned. Dominic stood in the dimly lit hallway, watching her with a look she couldn't decipher. He took a slow step toward her, his expression unreadable. "Tell me, Isabella." His voice was soft, dangerous. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" Her breath caught. She had nothing, no excuse, no lie that would convince him. Dominic reached out, taking her chin between his fingers. "You're scared," he murmured. She forced herself to meet his gaze. "And you should be." Her stomach twisted. "Let me go, Dominic." His thumb brushed over her lower lip, his gaze darkening. "No." The finality in his voice sent a shiver through her. "You're mine, Isabella." She felt her heart hammer against her ribs, trapped, caged. And then, in a whisper, Dominic sealed her fate. "You were always meant to be mine." And as the truth sank in, Isabella realized something terrifying. She wasn't running from a man who had power over her. She was running from a man who had planned to own her from the very beginning. If you were in Isabella's shoes, what would you do? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more captivating stories. Captivating stories. Captivating stories.